Hmm. So, I've been not taking questions, and they've built up online. So I asked them to print out, and we got a whole bunch of stuff here, but I don't know. Maybe I'll go into a couple of questions people are asking from afar. See if they correspond to some of the things you're asking near, and maybe do some text tonight too. So where we are in the text, it's actually sort of related. We're on page 48. Maybe I'll read the text and see if I can work the questions in. Let's play around with this tonight. So, Sixth Patriarch Hui Neng is giving the, what he calls the essential foundation of this school of thought, this direct teaching that goes back to the Buddha, and he describes it as Wu Nian, Wu Shang, Wu Zhu, which we translate as freedom from thoughts, freedom from appearances or phenomenal representations, and then not clinging, not attaching, freedom from clinging. And we describe it as freedom from rather than not, because what he's pointing to is that our basic nature, our basic fundamental nature, has all of these as its core. We have these freedoms, and it's when we attach to appearances, we attach to things, and we get confused in the thought process that we leave this, and then the freedom is lost. So this is really important, because what he's saying and why we use freedom from these things is kind of to say the absence of this is in fact the natural freedom, the natural liberation. But confused about this, we get very busy grasping, attaching, and so on and so forth, and leave that. So this would not work if there wasn't a fundamental proposition or understanding that we have everything that's it's inborn, it's innate, it's indwelling, it doesn't come or go, and the only difference is, can we access and use it, or do we forget about it, neglect it, and get lost? And so it's a functioning rather than a essence, if you want to say it that way. And so this is very important to understand, otherwise these seem like they're negations, but in fact they're liberations. They're liberations from that which impinges on that natural freedom. So then he goes on to page 48, and he's trying to make a very clear distinction, not to misunderstand what he's saying. He's not saying you don't abide in the world, you don't live in the world, you don't have the material things. That's not what he means by not dwelling. And it doesn't mean you don't pay attention to phenomena, nor do you stop or try to stop your mental, conscious, emotional processes. These have to be part of the freedom. The freedom from occurs right in the midst of these things. So he always uses that. Freedom from means right in the midst of them, you're apart from them, you're not clinging to them. So there seems to be somewhat, it's not, some people can see this as he's contradicting himself, but really what he's trying to point to is the dynamic tension or an equilibrium where you're fully functioning, you're alert, you're engaged, but at the same time, you're not setting up anywhere and turning this into something either as an identity or a stasis, because the very nature of things is constantly changing. You could restate the key concept of no self. Sometimes people say it's not self, but what it really means, there is nothing in our normal experience that is unchanging. Everything we experience is changing. There's nothing that is unchanging. Now you could be humorous and say the only constant is change. You know, I don't even go there. That's a little sophistic. But the idea is, since that's the nature of reality, then our freedom must come within, according with things as they are. So Dharma, if you want to use it in a kind of descriptive sense, is merely a statement of the nature of things as they truly are. And then cultivation means that you prescriptively align your body, thoughts and feelings and so forth with the nature of reality. And he is proposing that in doing this, you not only become free and liberated, but you access the deep inherent wisdom to see things in a very, very deep, broad way and not just narrowly. So he's then teasing out this tension. He says, yes, there are states that arise. There's constantly hundreds of things arising, the 10,000 things. What is it, Wang Shi? What are the things? Constant. The Wang is a 10,000. Wanfa, the 10,000 dharmas. Yeah, the 10,000 phenomena means all of our experiences, and it means the interaction of our mental, physical with the larger world. This whole interaction is called the 10,000 things. And he said that is the nature of things now, but he's saying don't rouse yourself over them, don't cling to them. And then he says, this last part before we get into, he's saying freedom from thought is misunderstood. Now, what he's pointing to is obviously perhaps you could say Buddhist, but I'd say it's associated with quietism. And quietism is a movement that basically says access to the nature of things as they really are comes from a quieting of the processes of mind, body, and emotions rather than an activation of them. And it's a movement that you can find in contemplative traditions. It's not just Buddhist, it's Taoist. There's even a quietism in Confucianism. It runs through South and East Asian traditions. And you can even find it in certain poets who commune with nature, contemplate with nature, and they get access to what is deeper, more profound, more abiding, if you want to use that word, more poignant and relevant, not by acquiring and going out and activating consciousness, but by stilling consciousness to listen to harmonize with, to absorb. Sometimes people will use the expression returning the hearing or returning the light to listen to the essential nature. But this has an external aspect too, that you quiet your senses down and put yourself in a situation where you're observing and contemplating, not activating. There's a famous expression, the Taoists do it, they say Zhou Wang, which means sitting into forgetfulness. You just forget everything. Yesterday, today, tomorrow, you forget about it. Home, family, food, whatnot. You sink into this Zhou Wang, it's called, sitting to forgetfulness. And it's, the expression say, I came upon him and I saw him sitting out in a hut, and I looked and I thought he was dead because he wasn't moving. He was just sitting there like a bench. And then as I got closer, I realized, well, he still had color in his cheeks. And he said, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, I was doing fine until you asked me that." I was Zhou Wang. I was losing myself in forgetfulness and according with the 10,000 things. So this is how they express it. There's another expression that says, "To the still mind, the universe surrenders." To the quiet mind, the universe, the 10,000 things become known and how they work in the functioning. And this is to some extent what in the Buddhist tradition Pratyeka Buddhists do. These are a kind of enlightened person who becomes enlightened by the contemplation of the natural flow of things. So they go into the remote mountains or deep valleys and they watch the coming and going of the seasons, of the stars, the planets, and so forth, the seasons in nature, and they also then begin to watch the coming and going of their own thought processes, and they awaken to what are called the 12 conditioned links, and how cause and effect stirs consciousness, consciousness stirs activity, which stirs karma, which then results in a turning of this wheel. And they're able to watch that and sort of in a sense get out of the turning wheel. So their awakening is called, they're awakened to conditions, or they're called solitary awakened ones because they awaken on their own without a teacher and through just a direct observation. Which is really interesting because it shows that there is this potential that we have right within our own immediate being to access this if we knew how to be still, to be quiet, to observe. So part of I'm rambling a bit, but part of this has to do with who is he talking to here? It's like freedom from thought in the midst, freedom from appearances. These are people who are actually moving along these lines already. They're trying. They got some rudimentary basics here that they're working with. He's not going to the marketplace and saying, hey, everybody can have your attention. I want to tell you about freedom from thought, freedom from appearances, and freedom from dwelling. And what is he selling something? People normally are so busy, so caught up, so lost, that these words aren't even going to resonate. This is going to a particular group that came to him and asked specifically, how can we cultivate ourselves? When they're asking this question, they've already put down a lot of stuff. It's not like he's trying to, you just turn on the television, there's a Sixth Patriarch trying to get your attention. It's not going to. You're actually in a space where you're reaching out. To some extent, you've had experiences where you've seen the impermanence of things. You've had some sort of disquiet or disenchantment with the nature of things as they are. There's something stirring. You might have an intuition and impulse that there's something more, and that it might have something to do with something in you, how you think, orient, feel, or whatnot. So you're beginning a process of both disenchantment and dissembling, taking things apart in a sense, and then you're also tapping into something. It could be a faint voice, an inclination, a stirring of something whole or energized or bright within your own being. And so that they're in that space. Now they come to him and he can work with that because they're coming with a question. They're coming with a rub. And because they have a rub and a question, then there's a possibility that this will go in. So this is not just a beginner's thing that he's doing. So when he starts this, he's talking to people probably who are meditating a bit, and that's why you can get to this next passage where he says, if you try to stop your thoughts completely, this is a mistake, and he's telling them to take heed at this. So probably what they've been doing, some of them have misunderstood quietism as being a kind of almost self-induced lobotomy, a kind of zoning out and numbing down the senses with the idea if I don't think, I don't feel, I have nothing at all, that's this liberation. And so they go into what he would sometimes is called dark or dull emptiness. It's not the true emptiness, but it's a actual clinging to nothingness. And so he's warning about that. Then he goes on to say, if you don't recognize your own mistaken interpretation of the teaching, the Dharma, how much more you will mislead others. So now he's also talking in the sense that they're perhaps teachers. There are monks and nuns there, and there are scholars there, and devoted lay people who are in one way or another either teachers or models or inspirations to others. And he's saying, even if you don't teach, but you practice in this way, you'll confuse others. If you just pull away, withdraw completely, and shut down, and go into this dull emptiness, it'll mislead people. But more so, he says, if you actually go out and teach people, meditation is having no thoughts, stopping your mind. Basically it's malpractice. This is what he's saying. And no insurance is going to cover this because in the realm of karma, there isn't any kind of insurance like that. So you do not see your own confusion and discredit the sutras, meaning you misinterpret the sutras, and that is why we establish freedom from thought as our source. Okay. Then he goes on. We'll read this passage and see if we can get into these questions a little bit. Good and wise friends, why do we take freedom from thought as our core principle? Because there are deluded people who claim to have seen their essential nature, yet their minds get stirred up over sensory states. They then create wrong views or view wrongly, see wrongly based on these thoughts, and from this all kinds of afflictions, klesha, and misunderstandings are generated. In our own essential nature, there's basically not a single thing that can be grasped. To hold that there's something to get leads to reckless talk of failure and success, and then to afflictions and wrong seeing, wrong views, and therefore our teaching establishes freedom from thought as its source and core doctrine. This is a very, there's a lot here in this passage. when he asked the question, why do we take freedom from thought as a core principle, in a sense, what he's saying, if you remember what he said earlier, there is no teaching. I have no teaching. Okay, remember that basic part where he says, I have teaching, I only expedient untie knots and call it this or that? And so now he's saying, even setting up this principle is really not setting up a principle, it's a counteractive. It's not meant to set up the doctrine of our school. He says, only because, you see his line, why do we set it up? Because there's confusion. Because people get deluded and make these claims about this. And he said, therefore, the antidote of freedom from thought has to be established. Remember he had the verse competition going back with Shensho, and Shensho says, brush it clean, let no dust alight, and he said, Bunlai, basically there's not one thing. He's saying essentially the nature is whole and complete, there's nothing. But if you mistakenly do something, then the Dharma has to come as a corrective for it. So Dharma, in this sense, is only therapeutic medicine to counteract a twist, a distortion, an illness, a binding. But that's why, he's very careful, because you could say, oh, you're setting up a doctrine now. And he's saying, no, even this that I talk about, these three things, are basically where people get confused. They get confused about the appearances, and they think these appearances are something about the self and me and mine that they can get them. Or they get confused about the inner thought process and emotions arising and get swept away by that. Or they want to cling and grasp either to thoughts or ideas or material things. And these fundamental ways, people go wrong. Even he's saying attaching to meditation states. Because they'll say, oh no, I've left it all behind. I've given up all my clothes, my hair, all my possessions. I just wander free and easy. But I'm looking for this state. I'm looking for this experience. And that quest, he says, is still not true. And so that's why he goes on, he says, you've got to understand, in this essential nature, there's basically not one thing that can be grasped, that can be got hold of. And that not getting hold of anything allows you to stay within the wholeness and the fullness of your nature as it is without any lack. But as soon as you have the urge to get something, you've already left the primary ground because you misunderstood that. And then he will say, the further you look, the further away from it you go. There's no way that you'll get satisfied with this because you can't get it by going out and grasping. So this becomes really core. But you can see, although it seems sometimes there's maybe contradictions, or like you could say there's little inconsistencies, it's not incoherent. It's very coherent. And those inconsistencies comes because this fundamental idea that we're whole and complete is sometimes so counterintuitive to our present state of understanding that when he presents these antidotes, he said, well, wait a minute. When do I get it then? He's saying, have freedom from. Then when do I get it? You say, no, that's the whole point. And he keeps having to come back to this. We're not alone in this. I mean, certainly I'm not. And you get to these disciples who've been cultivating for a long time, and still, at this point, they get stuck. We'll go into these lively encounters where somebody's really been practicing, cultivating really sincerely, and all of a sudden they have the thought, well, wait a minute, who gets bodhi? Who gets nirvana if there's no self? And the guy, it goes into total panic, and the Sixth Patriarch says, oh gosh, you misunderstood. I've been doing this all the time. You still are searching for, bodhi as it was some kind of state that you can get, own, put in a box, carry with you, my precious. It's not. And so he's saying this, and he has to say it again and again. Why does he have to say it again and again? It's really funny. I've been looking at this text since 1975. Every time I come over this, like, wow, yeah, that's right. And wait a minute, I read this in 75. Why am I coming back to it? And and again, because the habit energy of setting up the me and the mind thing is so strong that, the medicine never seems to lose its potency. How else do I explain it? That's why these things are wonderful. I always thought if you're going to, what do? You bury these capsules and you dig them up a century later. What are those things called?
Time capsules.
Time capsules. Like, what would you put in it? I would put this in it. And you say, well, what language? I don't know. You put it in a bunch of languages. But, in terms of a guiding thing, in terms of a high point of wisdom civilization, this text and texts like it are probably our most precious resource because it's the thing we most forget. And yet, from his point of view, it's the thing that's most obvious. So, what he's saying to these people, these are people who in some way or another have begun a process of what we call san wu lo shui, or some form of, you could say, disciplining themselves morally through precepting shila, that they're practicing some form of calming the mind, calming the emotions, calming the lifestyle. We always think it's calm, but calming doesn't mean you just sit and then you go out, and try to start up Google or something. It means that your whole lifestyle, 24/7, is moving more and more to a space where you can, within a undisturbed quiet zone, begin to see things as they really are. It doesn't mean you just sit. This is really important. So they're destimulating their sensory organs, okay? Now, you could say, some people say, I don't know if this is true, they had an easier time at it than we do, because they didn't have iPhones and iPads and computers, and let's see what else. Anything else that constantly grabs the attention?
TV.
Yeah, well, electricity is both, it's a blessing and a curse. This is one of a section in Kurosawa's movie at the end where this guy comes across this old man who's fixing his water wheel and it's going, and he's saying, wow, where's the electricity? And the old man says, don't need it. He said, well, why don't you need it? He says, what would we need it for? Well, at night it gets dark. The old man says, it's supposed to. And the young man scratched his head and he said, well, then what do? Well, we go to sleep. And then in the morning it gets bright, we get up. And he says, yeah, a lot of things you think you need, you don't really need. It's a really wonderful exchange at the end of this, one of the vignettes of Kurosawa's. But that being said, let me put it this way. Maybe it is harder, and some people say it's harder now because the amount of things available to the busy mind, if you want to reach out for them, they're much more diverse and all over the place than they were, say, at the Tang Dynasty. However, I will say, if your mind's determined to grasp and attach, even alone in a cave, you can do it. I mean, you can be busy alone in a cave. And I see this happen. Every summer I go up to Maine. There's nothing, right? And it's really quiet. It's just the lake, the loons, the moose, and the moose don't care about you. They're not interested in you. They can't mate with you. They can't eat you. They don't care about you. They just go their way. And so there's really nothing going on. And the day will go. And because there's no electricity, we're in that. But very, very few people can settle into that and be content. All of a sudden, you're sleeping and a group comes up and you hear, all right, everybody up, let's organize the day for the projects. We're going to go out and get blueberries, strip bark from the trees, make this and that, and we're going to run to town and go, whoa. Because the stillness, the quietness is disturbing. And so the habit energy that wants to grasp and attach, sometimes when it gets a space where it doesn't have to, it goes into overdrive. And that becomes an opportunity for self-reflection. It allows you to see where your energy is. When we're here and immersed, we're so habituated and so plugged in and tied in all the time that we take it as normal. And then when you're dropped into stillness and silence, if you're pretty centered and whatnot, you go, wow, great. But most people get agitated, and then they start to self-stim. We used to call it self-stimulate, by creating things to grasp and attach to that they're not there. I mean, for example, up in Maine, people run around frantically. I hear people tromping through the woods all the time when they're with their cell phones trying to get reception. So, I mean, they're actually tripping and falling over these beautiful things, trying to get reception. And the dog goes around with them thinking they're going to play. Because the dog sees people running, think we're going to play something. No, they're like, God damn it, I can't get that. Trying to get reception. And the dog's like, what is that? You're going to throw that so I can fetch it? It's really quite absurd. And all of a sudden, in the midst of that stillness, there's a hyperactivity that starts to take place, driven by this. So I think what he's talking about here, he's talking to people who have begun to de-stim as much as possible so that they can attune and listen to this nature, returning the hearing to listen to the nature, returning the seeing to see the nature. Okay? It's a concept of that. So then he goes on, and this section is really quite important, because this is where a lot of people go wrong in my experience. In my own experience, I have gone wrong. Not as much anymore this way. I go wrong in other ways. I'm very creative. But in this particular way, especially in the early days when we were all beginning to practice with our teacher, this one was a fundamental error. He says, to hold that there's something to get leads to reckless talk of failure and success, and then to klesha and wrong views. So he's saying, why we establish freedom from thought, freedom from clinging, freedom from appearances, is it puts you on a solid and safe ground to begin the practice of investigation and contemplation. You won't go wrong. You won't go wrong if you just hold steady to the practice that you're doing, not attaching to anything, not seeking anything, not wanting anything. Eventually, gradually, just by things falling away that aren't true, that are false, the true will manifest by itself. But if you think there's something to get, then he's saying that's where you have then the thought, I'm getting failure and success. Failure and success here means, is my cultivation working? Am I getting something? I'm going to the next session. At this session, I'm going to break through. I'm going to get it. And you have this mind, and you're self-stimulating again. And so you're actually turning a proper dharma, which could be a session or meditation or session or retreat, into a quest, into a spiritual quest, with a timeline of 6 days, 7 days, however long you're going to do that. And what happens, he says, you think there's, and if you don't get it, you failed. And why it's wise not to charge money, because then people can't ask for their money back. No money back guarantee you're going to win. But you might think you succeed. And he's saying that wish to succeed and fail is misunderstanding that there's nothing to get. It's whole and complete. All you have to do is let go. Even let go of thoughts of failure and success. Because those, even at the most subtle level, will obstruct the process. And so it's like, but that's so easily said and so hard to accomplish. So some people think that bringing the bodhicitta, the resolve, the aspiration for bodhi, is a wish to get. And it's not. You got to be careful with this. It's an aspiration to return to become that full, whole, complete that's already there. It's an aspiration to remove all that stands in the way. But if you turn it into, I want bodhi, and I'm going to get bodhi, come hell or high water, and if I don't get it at Berkeley Buddhist Monastery, I'm going to go to Tibet. And if I don't get it in Tibet, I'm going to go to, blah, blah, blah. And if I don't get it from this teacher, I'm going to go to the next teacher. And you start this quest, and it can become an incredible source of burnout and frustration because it's based on a false premise. The other thing that comes with that then is fear, failure of failure. In other words, anxiety that I'm not getting it, and I'm getting older. Or the week's going on. So if it's a 7-day retreat, you say, well, first day, okay, second day. Now it's getting to the fourth or fifth day, and I still haven't gotten bodhi. And the time is clicking. And it's really, you start to sweat. You start to get agitated. And then sometimes what happens, you sort of look around and say, oh my gosh, like she's sitting really quietly, and she looks happy. I think she got it, and I didn't. And then there's a little envy and jealousy, and your mind just goes wild. And then afflictions arise. See what happens then, he says, that in turn gives rise to afflictions, klesha. It could be, I'm not going to get it, it's hopeless, and you go into a torpor and you sink, you despair, or you get agitated and want more, and you start looking for then signs that you might be getting it. And these can be self-generating. There are things that apparently happen that aren't sought after. Visions. Auditory, verbal, nasal, sensory, that are associated with the return, okay? And the texts talk about these. Shurangama, for example, talks about the various states that can occur as you peel through the layers of the false self called the five skandhas. And there's states associated with each one, with the form skandha, with the feeling skandha. And the text actually outlines, it's not exhaustive, but it says here are some of the things that could happen when you're really concentrating and working on this method, returning the hearing and so forth. In this state, this might happen, or this might happen. You might see other people's thoughts, or you might have a vision, or you might remember a past life, or, and it goes all, some of them are pretty far out. And you read it, but the text always says, so what? It just means you're doing the process. It's very natural. Let it go. Do not think. The text says, however, if you think you're special and you've attained something, then you leave the path and you go down a crooked road and get all confused. So this is mapped out in the text, but he's just saying in a very straightforward way here, if you do that, that's how you give rise to the klesha, and then seeing things not clearly. Therefore, the teaching establishes freedom from thought. Therefore, meaning, why? Because people go wrong in these ways. If people did not go wrong in these ways, then he would say, I would not establish this as the teaching. So this is really important to realize. So even though we can read this, and even though we can maybe get into a mindset that I'm not going to seek for it, I'm just going to let it be natural, it's very subtle how the urge can come up. Now, maybe the urge doesn't come up and you're okay, but then a state arises, one of these states, and you get excited. It's like, well, it wasn't seeking anything, and this one came. Whoa, It's really subtle, and you grab onto it, and you think you got something, and you want, and it's like, yeah, then you get stuck. Or you've been meditating, you've been practicing a while, and all of a sudden another state comes up, which is fear, frustration, depression, anxiety, anger, and you think, I'm not doing it right. And you sink into the other side. This is a sign that I'm doing it wrong. And either one of those, I think what the Shurangama Sutra is saying, if they're glorious and far out states, or if they're unpleasant and upsetting states, treat them the same. Treat them as just passing phenomena like dreams, illusions, bubbles, and shadows, and you'll be okay. So my teacher would say, just see the extraordinary as ordinary. So whatever comes up, just see it as ordinary, not as extraordinary, and you'll be fine. But don't make something out of it, because the wish to make something out is this very subtle craving. It's a very subtle thirsting at a deep level. And basically, if you look at all the teachings, this thirsting, this longing, is really at the heart of where we misstep, where we go wrong. And yet, the anxiety arises, if I don't crave and thirst, I'll be nothing. And so, instead of actually getting into having the experience of reducing that, we fear as if in anticipation that we won't have anything, and so we never make the step away from the thirsting, even when we turn it into spiritual thirsting. And so it becomes a self-generated impediment. And that's why this is an important passage. Now, the questions that came up around this, that from online or email. So one is the passage that we just read and continues this week. It's at 47-48 at the bottom. In each continuum moment of thought, do not dwell on previous thoughts. If you think about the previous thoughts, the present thought, and take up future thoughts, then your thoughts will continue without cease. This is bondage. If in each continuing moment of thought do not cling to anything, this is called freedom from bondage. And that's the meaning of our school. So the question is sort of like a person's really struck when this not dwelling in these thoughts continue without cease. And then the question is, so implies sort of, I don't know where to start here. that's the statement. It seems to advise disrupting the continuity of an internal dialogue. Is that correct? If so, are there techniques for following this advice? For example, in other words, following the advice here of not dwelling on thoughts. For example, paying attention to the ways one thought leads to another, or what to practice, or so forth. So this is a more practical question of what does this mean and how would you apply it? So the first thing I think, I'm just going to give a shot at this. I think the first thing to remember is very clearly he's not saying you do not think, because you could go wrong there and think, okay, if I could just stop these thoughts, then I would be there. So then it's, what do I do with the process of thinking? And that's why I think the line is important here. And he says, in each continuing moment of thought. You see that line? And then you turn the page and it's again, he says, if in each continuing moment of thought. So what he's describing is there's a continuity of, and thought, again, I want to emphasize, is not just rational cogitation or abstract thought. It's the whole stirring and working of consciousness with feelings, emotions, impulses, urges, memories, dreams. All of this is that whole mental consciousness is working in all its variations. And so he's saying there's a continuity to that, and that continuity goes from thought to thought to thought. What he's saying is, let it be, in one sense, and don't try to stop it and hold it. Don't try to hold on to something that was a thought or feeling or emotion that is just past, because its nature is to continue, and it's basically empty. It has no nature of its own. This is just the momentum of consciousness at some phase. And now you say, well, then does consciousness ever stop? I don't think he's saying it stops. At least at this level, he's not saying it. Just becomes clear, and it becomes undisturbed, and it becomes free-flowing, but the stopping is not there. Maybe you could say it's like the water becomes pure, but the water is still moving and flowing. It's just less stirred up. But that's a process over time. When you're practicing, you start to see, oh, this thought, this emotion, this feeling, that's a dead end. I've been there 100 times. I'm not going there. And you start to just sift out. But there's still a flow and a continuous going, or you'd be dead, right? So what he's talking about is a process, and in that continuing process of thought, you sift and winnow in a natural process of observation. When I have this thought, feeling, urge, or whatnot, oh, it leads to this in myself and others. Okay, I've been there. I don't have to do that one again. And after a while, that reflection on causality within your own space leads you to sort of sift and winnow those things out. But you're never stopping. And so what he's saying is, allow the process to continue, and within that process, observe and watch and be mindful as it's happening, because everything is now a feedback in this process. Your reactions, other people's reactions, internally, externally, there's a whole thing going on that's an immense teaching if you take that data in and use it. And then what he's saying is, at no point do you set up, because you cannot set up. There's not one of these things that you can grasp and hold on to, the urge, the longing, the impulse, the thought, the idea. They go, they come and go, they come and go. And so he's saying, be alive, be responsive, but don't try to go back and get the previous thoughts, because you can't. Okay, it's impossible, they're gone. And even when you go back to get them, they're not the ones they were when they were. Now they're changed. And we know this about memory. You say, I remember when. But we already know that memory is constructed as you go backwards. It's not a recall. What happened is. It's not that way at all. Our memory of what happened before is being changed by what we're thinking and feeling now. And we restructure our memory. So even if you think you got it, you can't get it. So they say the past is never where you left it. You can't go back to it. And then you say, well, the future is fantasy. It's projection based on a present. But what actually happens in that future moment, which is the next present moment, really, if you think about it, could be very, very different than your future fantasies and whatnot. So the future has not yet. And then the present is just in this constant, continuous flow that you can't stabilize either. And so what it's saying is, even that's the nature, we still screw ourselves up by trying to go back and hang on to, cling, correct, the past, or to make all these fantasies and pretensions and things that we want for the future. And neither of those will actually ever turn out the way, and even when we get to it, we may have tweaked it in between. You know, you got this fantasy, next year I'm going to. And then in between, you're tweaking it every day, and then when you finally get to the situation doesn't allow for any of that to happen. Now, it might present a new wonderful opportunity, but you're going to have a bummer because it didn't live up to what you were planning. It's like, oh my God, it's raining. Okay. And I had my vacation. I was in sunny la 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 la. And, you know, it's like, okay, so you can't respond and do something when it's raining? Like, okay, so Maine. I go back to Maine. Maine's somehow stuck in my mind. Maybe because I want to be there. Oops. Instead of here, oops.
It's raining there.
Yeah. Well, no, you go there, and you come with the kids and the dog and the people. And the people have been working their butts off at, banks and stuff on the East Coast, and they come there, they got their fishing poles, and they got everything in their sunscreen, and then you see, as happens in Maine, a whole week can go with rain. Because nature doesn't say, oh, you're here this week. Well, I'm sorry, we'll turn off the water and turn on the sun. No, it just does its thing. Well, the geese and the loons and all those, they just go out and they do their thing. And the kids go, oh, kids, and they run around naked in the puddles in the rain, and they have a great time, splashing and whatnot, and playing with the mud, and chase the raindrops, and they splash, and the adults are moaning and groaning on the porch. Just miserable. And expectations, they just came, and what presented itself, they made, they took advantage of. So, in this way, sometimes you can use the contemplation of breathing. Now, this is another way to use breathing in this sense. There's various forms of breathing, using breathing for meditation. But one way you can use breathing here is the breath you just took is gone. Okay? It's like, no, you're not going to get it. It's gone. And the breath that you're going to take 30 seconds from now is not arrived. And the breath you have now is no place holding. So as you sit in meditation and you observe, you count the breaths, whatever, you can do another layer of breath and saying, just as is the breath, so are the thoughts, the feelings, the urges, the impulses. There's an inhale, and there's no place it stops. And then there's an exhale, and there's gone. You can't get and you probably wouldn't want the previous breath because now it's carbon dioxide instead of oxygen, but beside my point. The trees love it. And you let it go out, and it's gone, and then another one comes in. And just as it is, thought to thought, that is the nature of dharmas. There's the nature. They're not there, but there's no place you can attach and grab on. So if you can use the breath in a contemplative way like this, you can then get into the nature of things. Now, this is hard. It's really hard. You can, I'm doing it. And then you get up and you don't do it anymore. That's mine. Get your hands off that. My plans, and you start doing all this calculating again, and you think you're going to freeze it or get it or not, and you can't. It's just like, it's as I guess it's as elusive as I saw one of the littlest one up in Maine. She's just starting to walk, but really loving to walk. And she saw the kids out playing, and she went out to play on the lawn. And she was doing this, and then she looked, and there's this dark thing. And she got afraid, and she tried to run away from it. And she couldn't get away from it. And she finally just laid down and wailed in frustration. It was her shadow. And so the shadow was there, and she didn't like it, and every time she'd go, she'd try to get away from her own shadow. And so it's the same way. You try to grab onto these things, but you can't. You can't get away from your shadow. You can't get these things. And yet, I'm going to sweep the shadow away. I'm going to dig a hole and bury the shadow. I mean, she was beating the shadow and doing all this stuff, but the shadow wouldn't go anyplace. And, all the adults were, ha, ha, ha. It's like, well, come on. Are your plans and ambitions and aspirations any different than her trying to, get rid of the shadow? Not. So I won't go any further. There's another question that came up on karma. Maybe next week I'll get into that. Again, from Maine, just another example of how this sort of applies. In the winter, we pull up all the docks and the planks that go out off the point, because when the ice breaks, and then you put the walkway out, it's a wooden plank, and then there's a big dock, and then you put another dock out, and everybody can go swimming out, and it floats in the water. But then when winter comes, you close Maine down in the winter because it gets so cold, like 20 below zero. So we drain all the pipes and we bring all the boats into the boathouse. But the docks, because they're really heavy wood, we just pull up on shore and put on the shoreline. And then when the ice breaks in the winter again, you can ease them back out again, especially when the water's high. But sometimes I don't know if some of you are familiar with lakes, but sometimes with ice and lakes, when that ice rises and goes, it's very powerful. It can break things apart. It seems like nothing, it's just water, right? And it gets a little harder, it can break rocks. And it can take a dock and just snap it like a twig. Because that ice, and that's kind of interesting. I was thinking ice and water are friction's body, but it's very interesting what ice can do. But sometimes then when it thaws, the ice just pulls those offshore and just takes them down to the lake. And so when we get there's always a search. Two things we search for every year is we count the loons. The Audubon Society wants everybody in the lake, so we go out and we go to Martha's dock. She has hot chocolate chip cookies and coffee. We stoke up, we say hi, and everybody gets on a boat and goes in a different direction, and you just go and you count loons. It's not an exact count, but if everybody counts at the same time, you get a sample of what the loon population is, whether it's imperiled or not. Then we come back and we have more cookies and cocoa and coffee, and that's one ritual. The other ritual is you go searching for your docks and planks. And so you get in the pontoon boat, because to pull a dock back, first of all, you don't pull a dock. That's a mistake. You push a dock. Well, I was, a kid from California pulling a dock, almost sank the boat. You push a dock and you push it slowly, but you have to find it first. So when you find it, they're usually off in some cove or in a huge pile where they got stuck on other rocks. Now, to get in there with a pontoon boat, you have to be very, very careful, because the motor is displaced clearly below the water line as are the pontoons. You hit one of those rocks, you're going to rip the pontoon over and ruin the propeller on the boat, and you're stuck. And so what is involved is somebody has to go to the front of the pontoon and be leaning over, looking down really carefully. And they'll just, say, rock, rock, rock. And the person steering is going, oop, left, right. And you don't see them until you come upon them. And you can find your way in if you go really slowly, and you get it in, you can see the rock, and then you get on the other end, and that person goes rock, 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 and you find your way out. So when I'm saying present thought, past thought, future thought, this is where it really applies. If you're looking too far ahead, you won't see the rock underneath. Like you go, oh, look, that beautiful bird. Or look on the shoreline, and it'll hit, because you got to be right on. Moreover, if you look too far ahead, you can't see down, because the reflection of the water doesn't allow you to look straight down anymore. And if you're looking back where you were, the boat will also go off. So you can't look backward, you can't look forward, you just got to be in the here and now with that boat to get the dock out. So a very mundane example of the usefulness of this no dwelling, no thoughts kind of thing. And if you think about it, I suppose it could apply to a number of things that aren't strictly just meditation or contemplation. In many things, in art, in music, in many creative endeavors, but even in an ordinary day, without dwelling on past, without looking forward, just responding to things as they come. Those of us, or you, who live with children know that this is the only way to survive with kids. You have to really be in that here and now and still attend to things. But I don't want to go too much on the practical. Clearly this is about an attitude you have in terms of the deeper attachments that we make in life and how to steer and work with them. But the important thing to remember, I think if I were to summarize, is do not try to push them away and don't seek them. Let them be. And at no point do you want to grasp or attach or seek for anything. And if you can hold that kind of thing in tension, things will go a little smoother in the practice. And probably the practice as it becomes a way of life, which is the I Ching San Mei. So, anyhow, enough. Come back to more next week. I think we probably finish up this next passage is very difficult. It was difficult to translate, difficult to interpret. And then maybe take the next question. We got quite a few questions here. Did more come in tonight? Good. Good. Okay, any announcements?
Lecture, Sutra, 7:30 p.m. And also tomorrow in the City of 10,000 Buddhas will start the running session, 7 days. And also we have some food demo, I guess, tomorrow from 3 to 5.
Demo?
Demo. Laura, could you explain what's that?
It's a food demo on how to make your own fermented food and what the benefits of eating fermented foods are. So there's
Fermented food?
Yes, pickles, like pickle, sauerkraut.
Sauerkraut. I grew up with that. Sauerkraut, huh?
Yeah.
They're making sauerkraut at the monastery?
Well, this is a demo to show you how to make it.
Okay.
So we're gonna this Saturday.
You got some German Buddhists coming. I associate with my grandmother in Germany. It's just so.
Kimchi.
Yeah, I guess. Kimchi. Is
So
kimchi's fermented, eh?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they're doing sauerkraut on this Saturday and also the Japanese daikon. And I think that'll be the following Saturday. No, the 9th, I think is April 9th. They're going to do how to make your own starter yeast, sourdough starter yeast.
Sourdough. Okay. Wow.
It's YC and Peggy.
Okay.
Yes?
Yes. So,
I'm guessing that those of you who want to learn how to make it are welcome, and those that you want to learn how to taste it are welcome too. They're not necessarily the same. Let me know when it's done, I'll arrive.
yes. I think she's going to bring some. She makes it all the time, Peggy, at home, so she might bring some for people to taste.
See, I got these memories around it because when I tried to do it with my grandmother, it looked like it was a lot of fun, and she'd hit me with the broom to get me out. And she'd say things in German that I think I repeat, but they were, bad words for little boys messing around with the kitchen. So I stayed out and just ate the stuff. So I have no idea how it's made, but.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if anyone's going to do the sourdough starter, you should say you bring your own jar. She might just give you some so you can start there because it's a long process.
Okay. Okay. Well, avatamsaka and fermentation. We'll do the transference in English.
May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may their minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of their endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Ding Li San Bao.